Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's show. Today, I am joined by Dr. Ralph Hancock. Dr. Hancock, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate your interest and that of your listeners.
Awesome. Well, hey, I wanted to first give kind of a brief bio on you. And so everyone, I think, should know that Dr. Hancock holds degrees from BYU and Harvard. You've taught political philosophy at Brigham Young University since 1987, so you have quite a tenure there. You also are president of the John Adams Center for the Study of Faith, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. And you have a book called The Responsibility of Reason, Theory, and Practice in a Liberal Democratic Age. And also have a book called Calvin and the Foundation of Modern Politics. It was recently published by St. Augustine's Press. You've also translated numerous works from French. You're also the contributing editor of the quarterly Perspectives on Political Science and an editor at the online scholarly journal square2.org, which addresses public affairs for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And perhaps most importantly, you and your wife are the parents of 5 children and 10 grandchildren. Now, this bio that I'm reading, it might be a little old. Are some things have been updated here, I assume?
Can I update some things?
Yeah, absolutely.
We haven't had any of our own children since that bio was drafted. We have 18 grandchildren, ages almost 18 down to a couple of babies a year old, more or less.
Awesome.
And can I add one other line item?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not out of more more in the interest of my educational partner, Elizabeth Sexton. Elizabeth, a former student, and I are also the co-founders of Fathom the Good curriculum, which is just about ready to come online and launch. It's a home and independent school curriculum grounded in what I teach in the history of political philosophy. Fathom the Good. If it's not online at that address, fathomthegood.com, right now, it will be soon.
Awesome. Well, good for you. It's quite an impressive resume that you have there. And I wanted to first just hear a little bit about how did you come to, how did all of that come about? I mean, obviously there's probably a lot to it, but what's kind of the short background on how you got into all this?
Well, those autobiographical questions are always a little hard to pin down and be sure of, but I would note that, a key fact, it won't surprise people to hear that I'm a baby boomer. I graduated from high school in 1970. That means in my high school and college years, the moral political world was in tumult. And I would even say that today we're still experiencing the resonance, the shock waves, the aftershocks of what I experienced in my youth. And as a more or less good Mormon boy, if I can put it that way, living in the Pacific Northwest, not in the Seattle area, not in a Portland and then Seattle area, not in a dense Latter-day Saint area, from a fairly apolitical family, but still I experienced this tension between my Latter-day Saint, a kind of generic conservatism, and notably a belief in the goodness of the founding and the divinity, the divine inspiration of the Constitution, and all the tumult that was going on around me, the counterculture, of course, the civil rights movement, which kind of issued into the controversy and activism surrounding the Vietnam War. So all of that made it impossible for any alert teenager not to be thinking about what this all means and where the truth lies. So the origins are kind of there. And when I went off to college, first at Utah State University, mainly because of a football scholarship that was paying my tuition.
Awesome. So you had a football scholarship at the University of, I didn't know that. That's awesome.
At Utah State University, yeah. I could I could catch a ball. That thing, all the rest, like running into people and stuff, I avoided it whenever possible.
Well, I
But
played. I never had the ability to ever play college. I
yeah,
played from the time I was 7 until I graduated high school, but it was pretty clear to me that I didn't have the size or the talent to go
yeah.
beyond high school. So
Well, I
that's
wasn't
quite
very
an
big, but
accomplishment.
I was quick enough and I had the hands, but I got a good break, and it paid a year of college. And I didn't go beyond the freshman year because I'd had an injury, and I got an academic scholarship. And I thought I probably wasn't going to do this for a living. And all those uniforms were kind of smelly and dirty hanging in the locker room that you had to put on for practice the next day anyway. So I left that behind. But uh, but I was kind of, I mean, people with broadly political interests then as now tended to go to law school, and I thought that's what I might do. Uh, but after 5 quarters at Utah State, I went on a mission to the Paris, France mission. Uh, Checked in May of 1972, and but France was the exposure to French civilization was a part of my awakening too. Of course, on my mission, I could only dabble and notice some things, but the great respect of the French for the life of the mind resonated with me.
Hmm.
I came back to BYU. I came back not to Utah State, but to BYU after my mission, and resumed a major in political science. But by then, it was really the philosophical things that grabbed me. And I found I had a kind of knack for reading difficult philosophical texts and writing about them. So this is what happens when you just do something you love, and pretty soon you're not qualified to do anything else but be a professor. I
Hmm.
say jokingly because I feel very, very lucky and blessed. I mean, when people ask me, have you retired? I've had white hair for a long time. Actually, no, they allow you to teach at BYU with white hair, it turns out. Why don't you retire? Most people, when they can, want to retire, and maybe I will want to retire, or maybe my health will make it more advisable to retire in a year or 10 or 20. I don't know. But what I tell people is, look, I read books I want to read. Students are paid to listen to me talk about them, and I write about them, and then they send me a check every month. So
That's
what,
that's
what
not a
would
bad gig. There's worse things to
what
do.
would you change in this picture? Exactly. It's a bit of an exaggeration. There are some annoyances, administration. I mean, just the administrative side of the job committees and so forth, and some students who don't really want to be there, and some papers you'd rather not have to grade. But all in all, right? But I'm afraid I've carried the discussion off track. My interest in political philosophy started with a generic interest in the moral dimension of politics, and then was deepened philosophically by uh, teachers at BYU. I should name them, teachers who, uh, 10 years after I graduated from BYU, were my colleagues, and uh, remain friends.
And who would you say among among those are some of the names that most stand out?
Well, Lewis Mitchell, you may know Lou's name. He was an important part of the old Maxwell Institute before the new improved one. I say
Hmm.
with some irony. Uh, Noel Reynolds, a great political theorist, as well as Book of Mormon scholar, legal theorist. Uh, Don Sorensen, whom we lost recently, and I assisted Don in some classes while still an undergraduate. And Don, though maybe less well known than the others, was a great influence on me. Perhaps less for any specific teaching or even philosophical approach, because my approach turned out to be quite different from his, but just in terms of a man of integrity, with a kind of offbeat Socratic commitment to the life of the mind, who
Mm-hmm.
was as solid and true a Latter-day Saint as can be,
Mm-hmm.
and just a man of integrity who modeled the life of faith and reason. Uh, Don was important to me as a model, and David Bone, um, who was also my colleague 4 years and a teacher of political theory, more on the continental side at BYU. So those were some of my more important teachers at BYU.
And as you kind of were coming through this development process, developing sort of your own ideas about political science and political theory, who are the main, let's say, thinkers, philosophers, and such that you would say are kind of the big ones in your mind that have influenced your particular political point of
Yeah.
view?
Well, to explain that, maybe let me continue the acknowledgement of my teachers one step further to go
Yeah.
to Harvard, because that then links up with all the intellectual matrix that
Mm-hmm.
I have become part of. And let me say that when I went to Harvard because, like, I was accepted and it seemed like it might be a good thing. And at the time, John Rawls' theory of justice was quite new, and any political theorists among your listeners will recognize the name. Uh, this was really a landmark, kind of a modern classic that spawned a whole literature, a whole school, a conversation that really dominated contemporary political theory, kind of in the Anglo-American tradition, from the 1970s forward, I would say, and still has considerable influence. That's what I thought I was going to study when I went to Harvard. And I did end up taking a class from John Rawls. But here's what's happened. So this is kind of a decisive, not to over dramatize, but you might say my road to Damascus moment in my development politically, philosophically. I'll tie the two together, politically and philosophically. I enrolled in a class taught by Harvey Mansfield, and just a basic survey class in the history of political philosophy. And Mr. Mansfield, as we called him at Harvard, introduced this class with a lecture on Socrates and the empty center of liberalism. He's using liberal with a small l, meaning the liberal tradition of modern rationalism going back
The
to
classic liberal
Hobbes and
tradition.
Locke and the Enlightenment and so forth. And this was an introductory lecture to a modern survey, a survey that no doubt began with Machiavelli and Hobbes. But he began with Socrates and the empty center of liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And the thesis is in the title. Liberalism cannot account for itself. It cannot say what it's for. The most basic Socratic questions, and these are questions we now like to associate with, highfalutin philosophical speculation or dubious doctrines of natural law. But these are actually the most natural and immediate human questions, like, how should I live?
Mm-hmm.
What is justice? What do we even mean when we say a good society? What do we mean by, as we judge one society to be better than another, or one life to be better than another? These are the Socratic questions that the very definition of liberalism commits it to suppressing, to
Mm-hmm.
sweeping under the rug, or to ever deferring under the name of progress,
Mm-hmm.
for example. Anyway, when I heard this lecture, I realized I had met a teacher who could take me forward where I needed to go. Already in my study of Rawls, and I had written a thesis at BYU on Rawls and Immanuel Kant, the late 18th century German philosopher. And I knew there was something missing. And when I heard Harvey Mansfield, I said, yeah, that's what's missing. And so the point of that, the upshot of the recognition of this empty center is that you need to go back behind modern liberalism, behind modern rationalism, behind modernity generally, to the Socratic tradition, which, by the way, would include Plato and Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, most notably. You have to go back to that to recover a way of thinking that is in touch with this spontaneous, natural, ultimately unavoidable question of the good, to put it in a nutshell.
Yeah. So essentially what you're saying, if I'm understanding correctly, is that underneath, liberalism is built on a foundation, and that foundation is not liberalism. It is something more fundamental that deals with these really what end up being religious questions.
It deals with them by suppressing them. Modern rational liberalism, modern rationalism, I put rationalism in quotation marks because it presents itself as rational while suppressing the most fundamentally rational why questions. So that's right. But liberalism cannot account for its own foundations, or its own foundations involve a suppression of fundamental questions. Anyway, Harvey Mansfield, who became my main thesis advisor at Harvard and my mentor and friend. I had other great teachers at Harvard, including the now late James Q. Wilson, American government teacher. Look him up, very great man and great scholar. But Harvey Mansfield, when I heard that lecture, I knew I was kind of starting over. The core of political philosophy was not where I had thought it was. So I had my work cut out for me, but it was worth it, and it has been worth it. Now, if I can come back to your question more generally about intellectual influences.
Yeah.
In the first instance, they're sort of mediated by my teacher, Harvey Mansfield. But Harvey Mansfield himself was, in a certain way, a student of the famous or infamous, the great, I would say without hesitation, the great Leo Strauss. Mm-hmm. Leo Strauss was a German emigre to the United States in the years just before World War II, where there were many good reasons to immigrate from Germany to the United States. He taught at the University of Chicago for many years, the core of his career in other places. But Leo Strauss is the one who taught Harvey Mansfield and me to go back to the classical political philosophers to recover the core questions. Now, so I think Leo Strauss is, I acknowledge him without hesitation as a great mind, a great scholar, a great soul, really, in many respects. I've also had my differences with Strauss, or with the Straussians, the main body of his followers, or their different main bodies. We could get into that. But so Leo Strauss, controversial figure, kind of a lightning rod, considered to be like on the right of the American political theory profession within political science departments. But I have to acknowledge Leo Strauss. And along with Leo Strauss, I would say another thinker whom Mansfield introduced me to, and that would be Alexis de Tocqueville.
And with your background in France and French, I'm sure that that came pretty naturally.
Yes, and well, it was great to be able to read Tocqueville in the original. And so, I would say Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States in 1830 and wrote 2 volumes of Democracy in America, 1835 and 1840, published, which Harvey Mansfield, who has translated and introduced this book, University of Chicago edition, along with his now late wife, Delba Winthrop. I mention this because Harvey Mansfield, at the beginning of his introduction to Democracy in America, says that this is the best book ever, the best book there is on democracy and the best book there is on America, which I think is true.
And what do you think? What were the main ideas from Tocqueville that you I guess what are the, if you're going to name maybe the top 1 or 2 insights that he can give, because obviously there's a lot more than that, what would you say are kind of the biggest ones that impacted you?
Well, let's start with this, a tagline from another great influence on me, and this one more contemporary to me, and a friend, French political philosopher, Pierre Manent, spelled Manent, Pierre Manent, whose, I think, first book was Tocqueville and the Nature of Democracy. You should check out his more recent books, including more recent books. Here's Pierre Manent's most recent, Natural Law and Human Rights, translated by Ralph C. Hancock, forward by Daniel Mahoney. So Dan's another good friend and intellectual conversation partner and influence. Okay, back to Tocqueville. Pierre Manent, in his book, Tocqueville and the Nature of Democracy, says, it might be the last words of this book, to love democracy well, one must love it moderately. That's the capsule that he extracts from Tocqueville, and that's very good. To be a true friend of democracy is not to be a fanatic of democracy, or not to imagine that more democratic is always better. Okay? Yeah. So Tocqueville is a friend of what we would now call liberal democracy, and his appreciation is genuine. I mean, Tocqueville's whole point, he's writing in French, of course, and addressing Europeans, and especially the French who have lived through the French Revolution and aftershocks of it. Mm-hmm. Tocqueville is addressing the French and saying, this democracy thing is not going away. So how can we make the best of it? How can we see what's good in it? How can we steer it in the best possible direction?
And those are still questions we have today.
We ought to have them. I mean, but still so many people want to use democracy as synonymous with, I don't know, the best political system or the moral imperative of all social organization. Certainly not I, certainly not Tocqueville. Mm-hmm. Democracy needs to be subjected to a standard above the majority of the people. Otherwise, the people become a tyrannical, and I would almost say a kind of self-tyrannical body.
Yeah.
So
the tyranny of the majority is always a problem.
So I think I'm getting close to being able to explain why I think Tocqueville is so great, and why I would say everything I write is, in a way, it may seem very unrelated to Tocqueville, but in a way Tocqueville is a touchstone, because the kind of balance he strikes, which is not any kind of just sort of middle ground sort of moderation. It's not any attempt just to sort of balance two things that different people want and come out somewhere in the middle. No, it's a moderation based upon a profound insight into the human soul and the human condition. And in a word, that insight has to do with the fact that a democratic motive or impulse and an aristocratic, there's a naughty word for you, aristocratic motive or impulse are both like primordially essential to the human condition. And yes, we
Hmm.
live in a democratic age. There are many good things about it. But the human interest in aristocratic elements, which simply in something higher, in excellence.
Yeah, and this is sort of, I guess maybe we could see this in our modern culture and sort of the expert culture. The idea
Yeah.
there are those that are, sort of the modern aristocrats to some extent are the people that we refer to as, oh, well, we just need to, go with what the experts say. We're not going to democratically decide certain things. And so there's always that, at least as I see it, there's always a tension between sort of, well, what does everybody think just democratically, but then also what is sort of the expert opinion on these matters.
Right. Well, you've brought us close to the nub of the problem, because we have the very worst kind of aristocrats or elites, those who deny that they are elites, or those who try to cover their tracks. And our elites tell us that their whole heart belongs A, to democracy, and B, to science. And somehow these two things are two sides of the same coin. But
Mm-hmm.
how would that be exactly, or why should they be?
Yeah.
We have elites that cover their tracks or want to hide their power, which means they're not facing the Socratic question. They're not
Mm-hmm.
really standing up for what they represent. They're really not grounding their power in a moral authority of any substance.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of the dual, you could say, the dual power of democratic freedom, give the people what they want, there's no higher standard, and the authority of a materialistic science that denies any ground of morality. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's the dual, uh, the strangely complicit power of these two forces that Tocqueville exposes,
Mm-hmm.
and in response to which he shows us that the truth of human nature includes what I may call the originally Christian truth of equality. We are all, in some necessarily finally mysterious sense, children of the same God. And there's some, in even the humblest soul, there's some infinite value, an
Yeah.
image of God.
Yeah.
And it's also true that the aristocratic side is also true, that we need to stand up for something. And this something is always particular and contestable, and cannot be, you can give reasons for the virtue you stand for, but you can't give a final geometric or scientific proof of it. You have to know it when you see it. That's Aristotle, So
Uh-huh.
Christianity and Aristotle are the two truths. Can you see what just popped up on my screen, or can only I see it?
No, you can see that.
Sorry, but it made me interrupt my.
No, you're fine. You're saying Christianity and Aristotle.
Just
those.
It's making me.
Oh no, you're fine.
Update something. That is odd. These are the two sides of the truth that Tocqueville acknowledges and holds together, shall I say, better than anyone else, or in a way that is exemplary for me and provides this touchstone for all my political philosophizing. The truth of Christianity, that every soul, even the humblest, is in the image of God. And the truth of Aristotle, that virtue or excellence is a real thing, and we cannot be true to our humanity without seeking this virtue, which will always be, as I would say, particular, without any exhaustive scientific or like mathematical, logical proof. Doesn't mean you can't give reasons for it, but the reasons always depend upon the experience of virtue. Why are some things nobler than others? Well, in a way, my book, The Responsibility of Reason, is about trying to connect the sentiment, the experience of nobility with our reasoning capacity. But there's no final answer to this question.
Yeah, no, well, and with all of that in mind,
Jacob, hold that.
No, you're fine.
Because I'm going to put my phone in another room because I can't stop the text messages from buzzing.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay. Edit that out and start again. Yeah.
No, that's fine. So I was going to ask, with all this in mind, with that background and these influences, when someone asks you, sort of where do you fall on the political spectrum, or how do you sort of define yourself, your political orientation, what's the answer you give to that?
Oh, look, Jacob, I'm a conservative. I have no interest in concealing that or watering it down. It's kind of annoying because labels work this way. As soon as you use a label, you're playing into somebody else's definition, probably their own partisan definition.
Yeah.
Of what conservatism means. So that's kind of annoying, but that's just kind of.
So what do you mean by it? If let's give you a few minutes to kind of flesh that out so people know what you mean when you say that you're conservative. What is it that you are, let's say, conserving?
Well, Tocqueville and Harvey Mansfield would say that conservatism here and now for us Americans is about conserving the best of liberalism, the best of liberal democracy. Now,
which is a funny contradiction in terms for a lot of people, which I think we'll get into a little later.
Well, so that there is a kind of parasitic element in modern American conservatism because it relies upon conserving something that is not simply conservative. So that involves a kind of judicious balancing act. So conservatism is kind of a formal term that doesn't supply its own content immediately. I'm still kind of remote from immediate political concerns here, but let me say part of why this question is more difficult now than just a few years ago.
Yeah,
is that you could say that either that conservatism has kind of blown up and disintegrated and nobody knows what it means, or you could say that it's become very intellectually vibrant and interesting. And conservatism has always been more intellectually interesting than liberalism because liberalism goes with the flow in a way. Liberalism just sort of follows the instincts and the current of modern rationalism. But conservatism has always been more intellectually interesting because it has to ask about alternatives. It requires a kind of a break with what seems most obvious in terms of moral political premises in order to raise some questions. Anyway, the conservative intellectual world is in motion, and obviously Trumpism, a certain nationalist populism, which is not limited, needless to say, to the United States, is very much at work in the problem of saying what conservatism is now. People can read me on the Donald Trump question in pieces in the Deseret News from a couple of years ago and more, if you want to follow up on that. But really, the populist moment forces conservatives to face more squarely than they had the question of the nation, the question of the nation state and patriotism. To me, nationalism is not a scary word. The question of a reasonable and moderate nationalism in the construction or the preservation of a good American society or any society. By the way, on this point, if you want to know how shall I say, a rather hardcore and very articulate version of this nationalist question, you should look up the name Eric Zemmour, Zemmour, who's just thrown himself into the race for the French presidency. This is quite an accomplished historian who is rallying the French right on quite a nationalist basis.
I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, look, there's an article by Christopher Caldwell in the Claremont Review of Books, just out, I think, on this subject, which is excellent. But we were trying to pin down what I mean by being a conservative myself. The core of it is this: liberalism requires moral and religious foundations that it cannot supply. And that includes familial foundations. And Tocqueville is very strong on all of this, that American democracy is sound because of Christianity and because of mores, moral customs anchored in Christianity that ground the American family, and notably the role of women in America. There's a controversial topic.
Yeah. Well, and I would say, so just to kind of sum that up, so essentially you are conserving the best of the liberal tradition, in especially kind of taking Tocqueville's writings and his idea of the best of that liberal tradition is rooted in this social fabric of a good society, based on family, based on Christian principles and that kind of stuff, which creates the foundation from which a stable liberal political order can exist and work well. Is that would you change that?
That's right. That means there can't be any pure liberalism or purely liberal democracy. There can't be any purely secular or purely neutral state, for that matter. So what should be the role of the government, local, state, national, in backing up church and family? Well, that's a longer question. But people like to simplify this by saying, well, either you have a completely neutral secular state or you have a theocracy. But
yeah,
come on now. No, that's not the way. That's not the way the world works. It's not the case that if you allow federal funding for religious schools, then Savonarola is threatening to burn all of our books and impose a theocracy. It doesn't follow. It doesn't even follow that if you allowed voluntary public prayer in public schools, that dire consequences would follow. So none of that follows.
Absolutely.
You're beginning to sense what kind of conservative I am. In this contemporary controversy, contemporary ferment over the meaning of conservatism, obviously, there were two sides that have kind of become three. There's the more libertarian, capitalist, free enterprise emphasis. There's the more familial, religious, social conservative emphasis. The fusion of these elements was part of modern American conservatism from William Buckley and the National Review in the 1950s through the Reagan administration until recently. But more recently, thrown into the mix is this in confronting the globalist, the power of a global market, which is not a completely free or neutral market, but confronting the power of global capitalism has brought to the fore this populist nationalist element that needs to be heard. I'm not going to simply throw in my lot with Eric Zemmour or any or Viktor Orban or anyone else, but I would say to dismiss these people, to say at the first sound of anything that doesn't resonate with global borderless capitalism, to say, oh, that's fascism.
Yeah.
If you agree with that, then Hitler is on his way. That's refusing to think about the problems.
And there certainly is a lack of nuanced thinking in the current political environment at all levels, it seems. Yeah. So, well, I think we've been able to kind of wrap our heads around a little bit about your background, kind of what makes up some of at least the foundations of your political philosophy. Where can people connect with you online before we go into kind of the next part of this? Where can people, if they want to connect with your content online, where would you recommend they go?
I do have a website provided by BYU, which I think is ralphchancock.byu.edu. It hasn't been updated for a year or so, but almost everything is there, including links when available to books, articles, and conference presentations. But you can look at Fair Mormon for my talks there. You can look, more recently, I've done a couple of interviews with Greg Mattson at Quick Media, CWIC, and Greg does a great job leading me through a discussion of political philosophical problems at BYU. So those are some places to look.
Awesome. And yeah, that's where I originally had found your work through a fair presentation that you did. I found that online and was just really, taken with it. And that's kind of what I want to discuss as we go further with this. But let's go ahead and take a quick break, and then we'll get into that next part of the content.
Okay. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you want more content, including the podcast, go to thoughtful-faith.com. Thanks for watching.